Chapter 57. The Brown Jacket. We were in class when we heard the sirens again. This time they were loud, screaming past PNP's front gates. Mr. Curry told us to keep our heads down. The school day was nearly over and we were in the middle of a spelling test. Don't worry about what's going on out there. Think about what's happening up here. And then he tapped his head and asked us to spell the word impressive. But the heat had turned my memory to mush, and the sound of that siren had scratched at my brain until I couldn't concentrate. The bell went, so we put down our pencils and handed our tests up to Mr. Curry. While we packed up our chairs, everyone started doing that thing where they talk about every little part of the test until I could feel myself break out in a sweat as I tried to remember where exactly I'd put an A and an O in the middle of memorable. "Stop worrying," Jed said, tugging once at my backpack strap and then again until I smiled. Aiden and Sam were walking and talking behind us when the four of us stepped out into the beating sun and the pickup rush. The bike shed was jam-packed and we had to hang back until other kids had got their bikes out first. Car horns were honking, kids were yelling, the lollipop man was blowing his whistle, and underneath it all were the sounds of the bay across the street where pine trees lined the Esplanade footpath. "You coming back to mine?" Aiden was asking Jed. The whistle blew again and another car horn honked twice to get some kid's attention. I lifted a hand to block out the sun and half listened while Sam asked about the homework Mr. Curry had given the Year 5s. Something caught my eye. I kept my eyes trained across the way, at someone standing on the footpath in the shade of a tall pine tree. The blue of Port Phillip Bay behind her, and kids walking past in groups, or on their own, not even looking at her as they passed. "You guys," I said, but so quietly they mustn't have heard me. Maybe she wanted me to see, but I couldn't be sure. "Hey, you guys," I said again, a little louder this time. It was odd. Odd that she was wearing that big old brown jacket on a warm day like today, and she seemed to be hugging herself to the wide shadow cast by the pine. "Guys!" I yelled. Jed, Aiden and Sam, even a few of the last kids left in the shed, turned to look at me and frown. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and tugged on Jed's and Aiden's packs. Pulling them with me to the side of the shed, Sam frowned. "What?" Jed said. "Fred, what is it?" "It's Nora." "You don't know it's her they're looking for," Jed said, as the four of us peered across the bike shed to where she was standing across the street. Sam and I both gave him a look, and Jed nodded, a little reluctantly. "But it probably is," he agreed. "What are we going to do?" Aiden asked, once we'd all pulled our heads back. We'd told him at lunchtime that Penny had said about someone being missing from the Haven, and that we'd all heard the scream of the sirens. I looked at each of them, frowning back to me but also waiting for me to say something, to make a decision, to lead the way. And I can't describe it exactly, except to say that Luca had been right, about the compass inside us that points the way. It was like that needle spun on my heart, and from one breath to the next I knew what I had to do. I just hoped the boys would help me, that their own compasses would point the same way. "She's here to see Mr. Curry," I said. "She has to be. They've been working together and it's the only person that'd make sense. Sam, Aiden, you need to find him and tell him, somewhere private, where no one else can hear, and then get him to wait in the skeleton room for us." Sam and Aiden nodded and I told them to go. "Hurry!" Then it was Jed and me. "We can't make this a big deal. We have to act totally normal." And then we were heading towards the zebra crossing and the lollipop man blew his whistle for us. And by then, Nora must have spotted me, because she turned her back to us and wandered over to the other side of the footpath. "Check me?" I said, when I came to stand beside her. Nora had her arms wrapped around her middle, but when I said that, she eased them a little and turned to me, smiling sadly. "Hello," she said, and I could see she'd been crying. "Are you here to see Mr. Curry?" I asked, and Nora nodded. I could feel Jed shuffling, his feet nervously behind us. Then the crossing guard blew his whistle again in two sharp bursts that made Nora jump. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" I asked. She took a deep breath and nodded her head again. I put my hand out, palm up, and Nora looked down at it, blinked back tears. "Falamandarat, thank you," she said, and took it. Everyone must have thought that Nora was another mum, because none of the last few people left at after-school pickup paid much attention to us. When we got inside the school building, Jed ran ahead, peering around corridor corners, hand-waving to say it was safe to keep going. And then we got to the skeleton room, and Jed pushed the door open and held it for me to walk through, followed by Nora. Mr. Curry got up from his desk, quickly looked between the three of us and sighed, then rushed to her side. Jed and I went to stand by Aiden and Sam, watching on as Mr. Curry and Nora spoke quietly until she lifted her arm to wipe her eyes on her sleeve. Then Mr. Curry sort of leapt into action again and steered her towards his desk, where he offered her a box of tissues. "I can't go back," Nora finally said, blowing her nose, and then taking a deep breath. "I cannot. Furman, you understand. They will keep us locked away somewhere, and when the time comes they will send us back with no one knowing." Mr. Curry nodded. It was quiet in the classroom then, with just the sound of Nora breathing deeply and trying to stop crying, and Mr. Curry saying soft, soothing words to her under his breath. "What's going to happen now?" Aiden asked. Mr. Curry looked up at us, blinked a few times, and then frowned. "You are all going home. Immediately." "We can't do that," Sam protested. I felt the needle of my compass spinning again, and figured Sam's must have been too. "That is admirable, Mr. Murray, but you've all done more than enough." I shook my head. "What about the baby?" Nora's head snapped up and she looked right at me. "That's what this is about, right? The baby's nearly due, and you don't want to have it there, and you're afraid they'll send you both away when we're not looking." Nora closed her eyes. Mr. Curry said, "Miss Ramusa is applying for permanent asylum and is afraid she'll be rejected. Not right away, but a few months after the baby is born. You're right, Winifred. She's afraid that they'll both be sent back." Then a little more quietly he added, "I'm not sure this situation is going to help your case either." "Can't you just go back now to the Haven? Say it was all a mistake, she got lost and she wasn't really running away?" Jed asked, but Nora shook her head violently, and Mr. Curry put a hand on her arm to settle her. "Even if Miss Ramusa was so inclined, I do think they'll use her," Mr. Curry raised one of his brows as he searched for a word, "absconding as a reason to deny her application completely and immediately. They will make an example of her." Absconding was another policeman word I knew because of Luca, which gave me an idea. "Come with us. Winifred." Mr. Curry started to protest. "No, think about it. Take her to our place, Mr. Curry." But he was already shaking his head. "That is not an option, Miss Owen Ritchie." "She's right," Sam said quietly. "Nora needs somewhere safe to have a baby, right? Where's safer than a policeman's house?" "Well, the hospital for a start," Mr. Curry sighed. And then Aiden jumped in. "But they're looking for her, right? The hospital's the first place they'll look for a pregnant lady, and she just needs a place to hide until she knows for sure she'll be safe, and they'll let her stay, right?" Mr. Curry and Nora nodded at each other, seemed to have a whole conversation with just their eyes, until he finally said to her, "We could force their hand. Use my contact from the local newspaper to tell your story. Plead your case to the media." Just then, the sound of sirens rang out again. We all fell silent as we listened to them go past the Esplanade and up Ocean Beach Road. "Come with us," I said again, stepping forward a little bit. And then Sam stepped forward too, to stand next to me. "We want to help," he said. Mr. Curry tilted his head and frowned. "And how do you suggest we transport Miss Ramusa to your house?" "I ride my bike to work, and unless one of you happens to have a car waiting in the bike shed..." Sometimes I wonder what we would have done if Pop hadn't been home, if he hadn't picked up the phone when I rang from the teacher's lounge.
"Fred, why aren't you and Sam home yet? Is everything okay?"
Or if Pop wasn't my Pop and he didn't trust me the way he does when I asked him to please drive to school and come get us, even though he hadn't driven for months, and even after I refused to tell him why I needed him.
"Yeah, I'm coming,"
he said, and hung up. He arrived quickly, and Sam met him out our front and led him into our classroom, where he opened the door and dropped his jaw.
"You're the one they're looking for?"
Pop asked, and Nora nodded.
"You know they're walking up to people and pulling cars over on Main Street to ask everyone if they've seen a pregnant woman around town."
Then he turned to me and said,
"I hope you have a plan, Fred."
I gulped, but didn't say anything so then Pop added,
"And you'd better hope that Luca gets on board with it."
It's so easy to know the right thing to do after it's already happened, but just then none of us could have predicted the futures as we took our places and started following this path. "I have an idea." We all turned to Sam. "All we need is a distraction, right?"